Hey, what's going on, you guys? There's a particular intake manifold I would like to talk about regarding the 350Z as well as the G35 with the Rev-Up or Non Rev-Up engine. And this intake manifold is known as the Kinetix Velocity Intake Manifold made by Kinetix Racing. And it's been a lot of arguments and debates over this intake and shit on various forum sites and Facebook group pages, including the 350Z card page on Facebook, my350z.com forum, and the G35driver.com forum, of whether or not it makes power or loses power. And that's what I've been hearing. I've been hearing people mention about the fact that they say that this intake doesn't make power, it's only good for looks. What else I hear? Oh, I've heard this intake is only good if you plan to run a supercharger or turbo kit. Basically, people are saying that this intake loses power in the NA application. Well, I disagree with that. This intake does make power, but it makes power in a different way compared to a Plenum spacer, like above 6,000 RPMs, and I'm going to show y'all some different dyno results. First dyno results I want to show y'all is the one that Kinetix Racing posted on their website, and this is the one where a lot of people had a lot of debates over, and people are been skeptical about whether or not the results are real or not. And there have been some people that's been talking about, oh, the numbers are inflated and all this other stuff. Well, if you really think about it, these are some real results. Basically, what the guys at Kinetix Racing did was they got a 350Z that was completely stock. I'm talking about like stock intake and exhaust, and put it on the dyno. Oh, and before they ran the car, they got the car reflashed to where instead the rev limiter being 6,600 RPMs, the tune extended the range to 7,100 RPMs. Once they did that, they tested the car on the dyno with both the stock Plenum and the Velocity Intake Manifold, and you can see based on the dyno graph showing it's a big difference in the power curve. If you look at the power curve for the stock Plenum, it's making around 231, but at 7,000 RPM it was showing that it only makes around 205. Meanwhile, with the Kinetix Intake Manifold, it made around 243 horsepower to the wheels. And if you notice, like around 6,000 RPM, the power curve stays flat until around 7,000 RPM. So that's the main difference between the Kinetix Intake Manifold and the stock Plenum without the spacer. Z1 Motorsport did another testing like this like a year and a half later, and it also showed similar gains. It's just the only difference with this testing was Z1 did the testing with the stock rev limiter. So that's something I wanted to point out. Now this next test that Z1 Motorsport did was with a G35. Now this G35 they tested out had the Rev-Up engine. And just like the other two tests I showed y'all, this was also with the stock Plenum as well as with everything stock, like the intake and the exhaust. And with the Kinetix Velocity Manifold installed on this engine, it also makes gains in the high RPM range. And another thing I noticed, like under 4,500 RPMs, it's making better torque as well. So in other words, it's restoring some of that torque loss that's known on the Rev-Up engines, and I'll explain to that later on in the video. So anyway, so it's making 248 horsepower to the wheels, and then Z1 added some exhaust upgrades like a Steel and Trudeau exhaust and some high flow cats, and threw in a tune, and it was making even better gains. So the result of this was this car made around 265 horsepower to the wheels, and it also made around 263 to the torque wheels, and that's because the car ran on high flow cats. I've heard people mention about you lose some low end torque with this intake manifold. You really don't lose it until you run some test pipes. That's what would kill the low end power unless you run arc pipes. Now this next dyno graph involving the Kinetix Velocity Manifold is another one that Z1 Motorsport did. This time they tested it out with the stock intake tube versus with the Z1 M-Spec cold air intake. Now note there are two different versions with this cold air intake. It's the race version and then it's the street version. Now the street version is the one that's 3 inches, but where the MAV sensor reads, the inner diameter is 2.5 inches, so that's keeping the stock diameter. The race version is 3 inches, and that includes the MAV housing. Now this is the one that requires a retune, so just keep that in mind. But anyway, Z1 Motorsport did a testing with both the street and the race one. I know it's a little tricky to see the numbers based on how the picture came out, but if you notice, let me just point it out. So with the street intake at around 6,700 RPMs, it made about 8 more wheel horsepower than with the stock intake, and then with the race version it made an additional 6. So with the race intake you make about around 14 to 15 more horsepower, especially in the higher range compared to like with the stock intake tube. So the dyno graphs I showed y'all proves that this intake does work for its intended purpose. But there are still people to this day making the same shit, talking about, oh, this intake isn't making power, it doesn't make power, the shit is junk. Like this one guy named Cartech, he was posting a video criticizing this intake manifold. Like he talking about how he don't know how Kinetix Racing got a 30 plus horsepower increase, which he failed to take that in consideration of what I explained earlier in the video, that Kinetix Racing basically did the testing with the stock Plenum versus with the Kinetix manifold with the rev limiter increased to 7,100 RPM. So he failed to take that in account. Then he also made a comment about how the welds on this intake are known to crack. That was more so a problem with the old version, which was called the Kinetix SSV, and plus that was the version that people actually lost power with the natural aspirated. Now that's the one where it was good for force induction applications, but in the NA, that's where people lost power due to that design. But with the new design that Kinetix Racing came up, it was designed to make power in both force induction and NA applications. He also showed some dyno graph of a G35 some shop tested out with the Plenum spacer versus with the Kinetix, and he was pointing out, talking about how that intake lost power. Where he failed to take into account that, first of all, shop that did the testing only revved the car to around 6,400 RPMs. And also consider the fact this was a G35 with the 5-speed automatic. There are games running it in the 350Z and G35 automatics. It's just the only issue with running this intake manifold on a G35 or 350Z 5-speed automatic is it takes longer to get to the top end power curve, considering the fact that the 5-speed automatics have a longer final gear ratio compared to a 6-speed G35 or 350Z manual with the shorter gear ratio. So that's something else I wanted to point out. But nevertheless, that dyno graph he showed probably wasn't the best way to represent its real gains. I got a better dyno graph to show y'all. Now this next dyno graph I want to show y'all, this was with two different 350Z at the same shop with similar exhaust mods. One 350Z with the Plenum spacer, another with the Kinetix Intake Manifold. Now if you look at the 350Z graph with the Plenum spacer, the line I meant, notice how with the Plenum spacer it's making more power sooner, like between 4500 to around 6100 RPMs. Meanwhile with the Kinetix Intake Manifold, it's making better gains past 6000 RPMs, while with the Plenum spacer the power curve falls off, and especially if you revving it to 7000, it drops off by around 15 horsepower. So that's how much you lose, between 15 to 20 horsepower. I've had this Velocity Intake Manifold on my car for about a year, and I just gotta say I do notice the gains, especially in the high RPMs, and that's also due to the fact that my car is tuned to rev at 7200 RPM, which I got this tune from Z1 Motorsport. Prior to running this intake manifold on my 350Z, I had the Z1 Plenum spacer with the stock manifold. When I installed this intake, I did a third gear pull with the UpRev software data log system, and I noticed this made my car run leaner, like the air to fuel ratios, especially from 3000 to 7000 RPMs at wide open throttle, was between 13.5 to as high as 14.0. So what I did was I called up Z1 Motorsport and sent them the data log. A month later they sent me a new tune, and by the way, this is an E-tune. I reflashed it, did the same third gear data log pull, and I noticed it made the IFR numbers go down to more of an acceptable level, like between 12.4 to like 13.0. So that's due to the fact that my car also has the Z1 M-Spec race intake, as well as some test pipes and the Z1 single exit exhaust. With the other supporting mods I was running, that's what made the car run lean when I installed this intake. So, and then a couple of weeks after I got a retune, I took my 350Z to a performance shop with a dyno jet, ran the car, and noticed that it made the same gains that other 350Zs and G35 with this intake manifold. Regarding the power curve, the number I was making, the 264 at the time, that was still with stock headers as well as a stock throttle body, so just wanted to point that out. One more thing I wanted to point out in this video is the difference between the lower Plenum for the non Rev-Up versus the Rev-Up engine. Now if you look at this picture, you can see the difference in the length of the runners between the non Rev-Up lower Plenum versus the Rev-Up Plenum, and that's what changes the power curve of the 350Z by a significant amount. So that means for the non Rev-Up Plenum, it makes better mid-range power, while with the Rev-Up engine it trades that mid-range gains for top-end power. The bottom line is this intake makes power in natural aspirated applications as well as nitrous applications, supercharger, and turbo. With some exhaust upgrades as well as an intake tube upgrade like the Z1 M-Spec, the admin tuner, or even the lip mode tuning, you'll see even better gains with this intake manifold. And also a tune to raise the rev limiter to 7200 RPMs if you have a 350Z or G35 with the VQ35 Non Rev-Up engine to take advantage of this Velocity Manifold. I'll also post a link of a few different 350Z dyno videos regarding the differences between a stock Plenum with the spacer versus with the Kinetix Intake Manifold. With that being said, that is it.